So anyone who self-reported depressive symptomology reaching clinical diagnosis standards was excluded from the participating, although I should mention that several people reached clinical diagnosis standards at some point throughout the study. If you look at our other demographic information listed here, we were fortunate to receive a relatively representative sample in terms of it matching regional and demographic standards. And we retained 90% of our subjects across 3 waves, which is, to me, the most exciting thing that's happened. All right, so here's an overview of what participants did each time they came to the lab. The first thing they always did was complete a recall survey. And this was, it involved several open-ended questions where they were asked to reflect on their experiences the week of the Boston Marathon bombings. And they talked about who they might have been worried about, if they were there, if they knew anyone who was there, if they'd ever read. And at the end of this recall survey, they were asked to reflect on those answers and on their experience in order to answer 2 final questions on 7-point Likert scales. And these were, how affected did you feel by the bombings that occurred, and how much exposure did you have to the bombings the week they occurred? We'll call these our measures of initial affectedness and initial exposure. Following this recall survey, participants completed a potentiated startle task that I'll describe a little later. Then they completed a version of the same threat detection task we've been describing. And then finally they completed just a whole host of questionnaires. But among other things, they measured their current emotional state, their current media exposure, and some measures of how they perceived different risks and threats. So we're not actually ready to reveal all of our findings from the study just yet, but I do want to share just a few particular things that I think are particularly relevant given the other research we've talked about today. And so I'm going to focus on those 2 measures, those self-report measures of initial exposure and initial effectiveness. And I want to look at whether or not they're related to emotional detection at our second wave of collection, that wave in the weeks immediately preceding the anniversary. And we'll look first at initial effectiveness. So what you see here is initial effectiveness is positively correlated with current stress related to the bombings. And this was measured with the IES, or Impact of Event Scale, that has items like, over the past few weeks, I thought about the Boston Marathon bombings when I didn't mean to, or over the past few weeks, I had strong waves of emotion about the Boston Marathon bombings. And so the more affected participants reported feeling by the bombings the week they occurred, the more stress they had related to the bombings near their anniversary. Initial effectiveness also is related to how much worry they reported having about violent crime and terrorism, again, almost a year later near their anniversary. And this finding does seem to be subject to relevance constraints. So how affected they felt by the bombings was not related to, for instance, worry about their chances of having a heart attack or getting heart disease. What's particularly interesting here is when we look at these same relationships with that initial exposure variable. And what you see across the board are weaker, non-significant relationships. When we look at these outcome variables in terms of our predetermined exposure conditions, so whether or not you lived or worked in Boston, we also find no differences. And so what seems to matter in terms of your stress and your worry about violent crime and terrorism is not whether you lived or worked in Boston, your exposure to the event per se, but rather your emotional reaction to the event. And here you see the same pattern of results when we look at our threat detection bias measure. Right, so bias is on the y-axis here, higher levels, again, more conservative, lower levels, more liberal. And the x-axis is the 7-point Likert scale on which they rated effectiveness and exposure. So effectiveness in red, exposure in green. And we see that the more participants reported being affected by the bombings the week they occurred, the more liberal their response bias was in the weeks leading up to the anniversary. And as with the other outcome variables we looked at, how much exposure they reported having doesn't seem to predict threat detection bias, doesn't seem to predict this outcome variable. So moving forward, what we plan to do is look at how these variables change over time and how their relationship to one another changes over time. So what you see here is actually the average bias of the entire sample averaged at each of the different waves of data collection. And I feel like everyone should be crazy impressed with this figure. I'm really excited about this figure. what we found are changes in people's bias in the absence of an in-lab manipulation. All right? They did the same experiment every time. And yet we see at wave 2, that wave near the anniversary of the bombings, people have a more liberal, or at least a less conservative bias relative to people at the other 2 time points further away from the anniversary. And so what we're in the process of doing now is using hierarchical linear modeling to look at which individual factors influence, or predict rather, bias overall, as well as changes in bias over time. So in particular, we're going to look at whether initial effectiveness produces or is related to a more liberal bias across the board at all 3 time points, or whether it interacts with more recent media exposure such that it only drives threat detection when there are frequent and potent reminders of the bombings in the news, such as near the anniversary. I also plan to conduct similar analyses with 2 measures of physiological reactivity that we took during the potentiated startle task. And unfortunately, we don't have all of the physio data scored and ready to analyze, so I'm just going to share some very preliminary findings. But I do want to take a minute just to describe the task and to highlight why it is such an important addition to this particular project. So in this task, we measure people's startle blink reflex. So participants listen to very short, very loud bursts of acoustic white noise, which causes them to blink. And we measure activity in the orbicularis oculi muscle around the eye, which is involved in blinking. And we're interested in this measure because past research has shown it is moderated by a person's current emotional state. So the blink response is larger in amplitude when they're in a negative state, particularly feeling anxious or afraid, relative to when they're experiencing a more positive or neutral state. And so in the potentiated startle task, what we do is we measure the blink response while people view neutral images as well as images of the bombings. And so we can measure how negative participants are feeling while they're viewing those bombing images by comparing the amplitude of the blink response on the 2 different image types. Right, so how much is it potentiated, how much is it enlarged for the bombing images relative to the others. At the same time, we measure electrodermal activity, or EDA, which is a measure of sweat gland activity. Here the palmar sweat glands, which is a measure of sympathetic arousal, and so we use it as an estimate of bodily arousal. And here's just a screen capture during data collection, or data acquisition, I should say, so you can see how these unfold in real time. The green line indicates a startle prompt, so it's that loud burst of white noise. And you see the quick, very sharp blink reflex in the top row, and the slower but still very pronounced activity in the sweat glands on the bottom row. And so these measures are important for us because neither of them captures activity that is under conscious control. So they're going to be resistant to demand effects or response biases that would be particularly problematic in the context of this study. So nobody wants to say they didn't feel bad about the bombings, and nobody wants to say they don't feel very bad when they view images of the bombings. These measures also allow us to capture bodily activity associated with changes in affect that might be outside the participant's conscious awareness. And so they give us a way of checking more subtle changes in people's threat-relevant arousal and threat-relevant valence than we would otherwise have available to us. Right, and so as I said, it's not all scored and analyzed just yet, but I do want to provide just these 2 correlations as kind of proof of concept. So this is startle potentiation scored from the first wave of data collection. And what we see is that startle potentiation is positively correlated with a measure of state anxiety and a measure of state somatic symptomology. And that involves measures like I felt my heart racing a lot recently. And so as we'd expect, larger amplitude responses on the bombing relative to neutral images is predictive of people feeling more anxious and experiencing more bodily disturbances. And so the plan for these measures is to look at how they impact, or how they predict rather, threat detection performance, and how the relationship with threat detection performance might change over time. So even though there are still a lot of very exciting questions to answer with this data, and I want to talk with everyone about ideas moving forward, I do think that just the teaser results I was able to show you have some provocative implications. Right? So we demonstrated that incidents of mass violence, like the Boston Marathon bombing, can impact the average community member's affect and threat perception up to a year later. Right? And these are non-depressed average community sample. We also showed that emotional reactions to incidents of mass violence may be more indicative of future outcomes than exposure to the incident per se. That is, we found that how affected people reported being was related to more worry about violent crime and terrorism, more stress about the bombings, a more liberal threat detection bias, all near that first anniversary, while none of these outcomes was related to self-reported exposure or whether or not people lived and worked in Boston at the time of the bombings. And this, I think, has really important implications when we think about how you want to allocate mental health resources following future incidents of mass violence. Right? It suggests that targeting those resources just to people who live or work in the immediate vicinity may be missing the types of people who are most in need of or would most benefit from mental health resources. I also think these findings raise some interesting questions concerning the media, its role and its responsibility in terms of spreading and prolonging the detrimental effects of these incidents. Okay, so I want to spend the last few minutes of my talk describing some plans I have for moving this research forward. Do we want to stop and do questions again before I move on? People good? Okay. I'm going to focus on what I see as kind of three distinct lines of work, but all of them relate to how our feelings influence the way we reason about threats and risks. And I'm just going to mention all of them very briefly and kind of abstractly, but I'm very happy to answer questions or to talk about them in more detail with anyone who's interested. So the first of these lines of work involves examining more social or interpersonal threats. And in particular, I'm interested in how people make decisions about the types of threats inherent to establishing and fostering new social relationships, like deciding whether or not you can trust someone. So I think of this judgment of are they trustworthy or untrustworthy as another type of threat detection, where you're trying to weigh the potential risks associated with sharing your social resources with someone. And so I'd like to do some work with people interacting in the lab in person, where I can measure changes in affect across an initial get-to-know-you conversation and see how it predicts subsequent trust behavior and trust judgments of one another. And some of my past work has actually looked at factors that influence trust judgments in these kind of experimental contexts, particularly nonverbal behavior. There's a little screenshot of some of our participants interacting, doing some untrustworthy behavior. And for this line of research, I think my training in psychophysiology is going to be really important, right? Being able to measure changes in the body associated with changes in affect continuously throughout the interaction without interrupting its flow will enable me to capture things that participants might not be aware of or able to report on. But that might still be important in terms of what they draw upon when they're making trust judgments later on. I'd also like to do some work looking at how the presence of others, particularly close others, may moderate the effect of emotion on threat perception. And I think this is going to be important for moving these basic findings into more applied contexts, such as with the military or law enforcement personnel, who have this close other aspect built into a lot of what they do. Right? So police officers typically work with partners, soldiers work in small teams or combat units. And so understanding how the presence of another might augment the effect or might mitigate the effect of emotion on threat detection, I think it'll be really important moving this particular line forward. The second line of research I want to mention involves looking at more fundamental processes underlying emotion's influence on threat detection. In particular, I'm interested in whether how you feel can influence the way you perceive people and objects. And here I'm using perceive in the literal sense, so not in the colloquial sense. I want to know if how you feel can actually shape perceptual processes from the bottom up. And to do this, I'll use a technique from vision science called continuous flash suppression, or CFS, that I'm using in a number of ongoing studies. Again, I'm not going to talk about them, but happy to discuss if anyone's interested. But continuous flash suppression allows you to present visual stimuli outside of conscious awareness. So you can present visual stimuli to participants that they report no awareness of seeing whatsoever. I'll use this technique to examine whether an emotional state can dictate the content of visual consciousness. That is, I want to look at whether certain types of stimuli, like scowling faces or weapons, for instance, can break into consciousness more readily, can break the suppression effect created by CFS more readily when you're experiencing an emotional state relevant to those threats, like such as anger. And besides being really cool, I think this work is just really cool. But besides my impression of it, I think it also has important implications for basic emotion research. right? So understanding how emotions can impact these more basic underlying processes, these more basic perceptual processes, really has the potential to reshape how we reason about and interpret the ways emotions influence more higher level decisions and behavior. And the final line of research I want to talk about today is in some sense the most broad. And it involves thinking about the threat detection work I've done as like a special case of risky decision making, which I think of as being this broader category of decisions and behavior. And so I've done some work with colleagues at Northeastern to develop a novel framework of decision making called the Integrated Signals and Economic Framework, or the ISEF, which really has two innovations. First, it combines two types of risk, perceptual and economic risk. That's just what we've called them. I'm not going to describe what they are. Again, happy to talk about it if you're interested. The important thing here is that these two types of risk have been studied almost exclusively in isolation. And yet there's many real-world decisions that are made under both types of risk. And this is problematic because we don't have a model for examining how they might interact to influence decision-making. So cancer detection, for example, is a real-world decision that's made under both types of risk. The other innovation of the ISEF, and this is, I think, the most critical one, is that it allows us to model the influence of context on decision-making explicitly. And this context can be internal context, like internal to the decision maker, such as their affective or emotional state, their risk sensitivity or their threat sensitivity, as well as contexts that are external to the decision maker, such as how options are framed or what environment they're in when they actually make the decision. In essence, the ISEF tries to do for signal detection theory what prospect theory did for expected value theory. Right? It's a very generative model. It sets up a way of systematically examining the mechanisms by which different contexts influence decision making. So for example, in a series of studies in a grant recently submitted to the National Cancer Institute, we're planning to use the ISEF to model how stress influences cancer-relevant detection. And in those studies, participants are going to view some moles, and they're actually going to feel breast models for lumps. And I think it's going to be a really neat paradigm. So hopefully that gives you some sense of how I see my research expanding and moving forward in the coming years. I plan to conduct research that broadens our knowledge of how affect and emotion can shape the ways we perceive and respond to potential risks and threats, whether those be threats to our physical safety and well-being or to our social relationships and resources. I also plan to look at how emotion and affect shape more fundamental underlying processes that guide emotion and threat detection, such as how you perceive people and objects, as well as how these same fundamental processes come into play when we look at more complicated real-world decisions involving the assessment of threat and risk. And finally, I want to use my training in psychophysiology to move all of these lines of research forward by measuring changes in affect where it would otherwise be impossible. So to measure it where self-report measures would be impractical, obtrusive, or just not likely to be fruitful. And with that, I want to thank all of my wonderful collaborators on the work I mentioned today, and of course the National Science Foundation and the Army Research Institute for making it all possible. And all of you for your attention. Sure, Brian. Or should I call? Is that okay? Okay.
So just to go back to your first set of studies that you presented, I just wanted to ask maybe some semi-probing
Sure.
process kind of questions linked to the paradigm, and really trying to better understand how you're interpreting the effect of anger, whether it is just purely informational effect or whether it is in fact a perceptual effect, hearkening to your flash suppression technique idea that you're talking about later. So, in a fast decision kind of situation, there could be two sort of things going on. One is it just looks like a gun, and I say gun. Mm-hmm. And the other is crap, I don't know, gun. And obviously, decades now of research on the porous borders between conscious and unconscious, I recognize that those are not, in fact,
blurred line at best. Yeah.
Categories, but nonetheless, I felt with your paradigm, when you had the study where you gave the the fake pixelated images followed by the mask. When I was expecting that study, I was expecting you to just give the mask and to say that essentially, look, we're going to give you all the information in the setting except what's in their hand. We know you have to guess, but just guess, right? And so there they know there's no ambiguous information for them to see in a sense. They can't see a gun or see a wallet. They're just guessing, right? To me, that's more testing the pure informational, in some sense, in a judgment decision-making sense, the effect of anger in changing the expected base rate that doesn't have anything to do with what you're seeing, feel that you're seeing in a perceptual sense. They're both, I mean, they both could be occurring. I guess I'm a little bit unsure of which of those you think it is. So, I mean, feel free to just tell me I'm an idiot and why, but can you respond to that a little bit?
I can respond to that. That is not going to be my response. I think that you raise a very valid point about studies 3 and 4, the ones with the blocked images.
Yeah.
That said, the blurred image was exactly the same for every single trial. And so I don't think it's the case that they might be interpreting that image differently. But that doesn't actually really get down to the meat and bones of it.
I think that's partly why, just in sort of the experience of it, when people, again, I know we can't trust people's conscious reports, right, supposedly, but do people in that setting, do they say, oh yeah, it looked like a gun, or do they just say, yeah, I don't think I could see anything? I mean, do they have a false feeling of knowing, or do they say to you, I was just guessing?
So no, it's like long enough that as soon as they make the response, they know they're wrong, right? And so this is an example. We ran a study where just anger participants did the task, and after they responded, we gave them an open-ended window and said, respond again, right? So it got backward mask, open-ended, backward mask, respond again, and error rates dropped to almost 0. Right, so you see the bias at attempt 1, and you see almost no errors. We couldn't even do a signal detection analysis at wave 2. Now that doesn't preclude the possibility that something perceptual is happening, right? So it could be the case that within that window they actually perceive it differently, and then they have to, by the time they're actually making the response, they've resolved that perceptual ambiguity, right? So it doesn't entirely answer it.
So it's
but
not. So it's pointing towards not so much of a perceptual effect that I'm seeing an ambiguous image as a gun versus a wallet. I mean, and more the informational. Am I interpreting your statement right, or am I completely
what I'm saying is we ran this study hoping to get at that, and now I don't think it actually addresses that question, right? That it certainly seems like it's not the case that even after they've made the response, they still have this perceptual ambiguity, right? It rules out that interpretation. It's not like after the trial they still think they saw a gun.
Right.
But it doesn't necessarily rule out the possibility that something perceptual is happening much faster, and that, you know, they're still responding within 750 milliseconds. Like by the time they respond, they've resolved the perceptual ambiguity that initiated the first response, which is why we want to do some of the CFS work.
And it's just like with the last study, where I initially thought that totally was going to deal with, not that I'm concerned, I think it's good stuff, it's just whatever, we're always continually concerned, right? But I had a little bit of a wonder about giving them the base rates, because you show, look, you give them the base rates, and then that really affects things, right? Like there's no thing going on there. But I wondered about just a kind of cognitive load thing, like if you get people having to kind of do any other kind of calculation in their head while they're doing this thing, is that, I mean, my experience with emotion priming is it's pretty fragile, and so if you get people distracted on another thing, like, oh, I have to keep these base rates in mind, that could wipe it out, and it's not the information, but it's just you've got another task. I mean, do you think from your experience that's possible, or do you find that implausible?
It's certainly possible. My speculation would be that that is not the case. In particular, we didn't see sensitivity differences in that task, so I would expect cognitive load to affect performance across the board, right? So that they would do worse on the task overall. And sensitivity didn't differ there relative to the other studies. But again, that's just like some evidence in favor of one interpretation as opposed to a hard and fast resolution. But it would be interesting to do some of these under cognitive load. Yeah.
So I want to zoom out a little bit.
Sure.
You could go back to your last slide for a second, where you showed the different kinds of, that one, the future directions one. So it seems that like in the work that you presented, you're using anger as one manifestation of threat, and then you briefly talked about distrust as another manifestation of threat. But those are very different. So this sort of goes back to Haley's question much earlier, but in a more general thing, have you thought about, in looking at your whole program of research, what kinds of threat might lead to increased judgments of risk, which is your primary dependent variable measured in different ways, whether it's through the shooter bias task or risk perception and so on. Whereas other kinds of threat may not have the same kind of effects. So, for example, would social isolation as a threat or sadness as a threat, I wouldn't expect that they would necessarily increase risk perception. So, in other words, what is the convergence and what's the divergence among different kinds of threat? And in looking at anger primarily, you're looking at the converging part and keep holding constant the type of threat. But if you look at multiple kinds of threats, you might get very different effects, and the story then will become complicated. So I'm wondering if you've thought about that from a big picture point of view.
Yeah. I think what really ties them all together for me is this idea of like context dependence, that all of those different experiences of threat will only drive decision making about risks when the risk is relevant to that emotional state. Right, so sadness could actually affect risk estimates if you're thinking about how likely is your husband to get in a car accident or something that would make you sad. Like disgust should actually drive risk estimates if you do is the milk bad or not task as opposed to a gun, no gun task. And so I think everyone in this department does really great work looking at context sensitive effects, but not everyone in the emotion research world does that, right? So of course, anger doesn't always produce a liberal bias, right? It depends on the context in which it's brought to bear. But I think more systematic work examining those contingencies is important. And so that's a lot of what I'd like to do with my work, is demonstrate evidence for that.
That was a really great question. So I wanted to kind of follow up on Brian's and go back to studies 3 and 4 from the first set of studies. And I was really intrigued by the fact that the angry participants in those studies were pretty much half of the time saying there was a gun and half of the time not. And it was the neutral participants who were saying about 40% of the time there was a gun. And you've interpreted those data to suggest that it's the angry people who are showing, all the actions of the angry people, and somehow the neutral people, which I'd also like to know how you manipulated that, because that in and of itself is always open to issues. But, I don't know. I feel like maybe if I get a task, and I realize the difference is there, but if I were to get a task in the absence of any base rate information, why not assume it's equal? And if that's the case, then what's happening here is your angry people are actually more accurate to an assumed base rate than maybe the neutral people is where the action is. So that's my first question. So I'll let you answer that, and then I'll have a follow-up question.
So yes, very astute observation. One of the things we think, for us, the really important thing is the relative difference between the two. That relative to the neutral participants, anger expects to be more guns. There are many reasons why the entire thing may have shifted down in this context relative to the other context. For instance, you don't usually see a lot of guns, and so if you enter a task and you never see any guns in it, that might drop everyone's base rates down. Right? It might drop the mean overall, how many guns do you think it has, down overall. Whereas 1 and 2 and in studies 5, they see guns very regularly throughout the task. And so that might, push the mean up for everyone, essentially. And so really what we were focusing on here was this relative difference between the two of them. And our neutral participants just wrote about their typical day, which they shouldn't be called neutral participants. It should be our control condition, because what does neutral actually mean? Although I will say that we screened all of the autobiographical recall tasks. So we did take out the weird people who were like, my everyday is awful because I hate my roommate.
I don't know. I still, I realize, I mean, I'm in the same research area now with threat detection, so I know making comparisons between different emotion conditions. We're always talking about the differences. But, so I'm asking you a question that I think is hard for me to answer about my own research too. I guess I just wish you had more emotion conditions to compare these results to, because that might actually help to address the question better.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think the idea that maybe like anger is not doing anything here, and neutral is, like they're writing about their typical day, which assumedly does not involve a bunch of guns. So maybe it is that manipulation pushing base rates down here. And so you're right, having another emotion condition here in particular to compare these two would be great.
It would even be interesting if you were doing a follow-up work to just ask them like right up front. You know, it could be that angry people have developed a base rate in their head, it's 50%, and neutral people haven't. So they haven't even thought about what the breakdown might be. And that's a different explanation than the one that you provided. I mean, it could be interesting just to ask them, okay, we're going to do this task, describe the task, maybe give them one trial as a sample, and then ask them what percentage of the time do you think you're going to see this or that.
Yeah.
Just kind of, and you might see the difference right there. I don't know.
Yeah, that would be neat. Sure.
I'm actually curious about future directions. I'm sorry, keep
Sure,
jump
no
on.
worries.
In your plan, I'm not sure if it's current or planned research with continuous flash suppression. I'm curious about how you kind of relate that to the nature of objects that remain dominant in binocular rivalry. Because I know that there's been less work with entry into conscious awareness than with rivalry. And I'm curious about the relationship that you kind of see with that work and your plans with looking at that in the context of emotion.
Yeah, I think they're very similar, and I would expect to find relatively consistent results with what they've shown in binocular rivalry. So I know there's been some work to suggest that, like when you're feeling a negative emotional state, so in binocular rivalry they show two images at once, one to both eyes, and only one of them can actually dominate visual consciousness at any one time, and so you can measure how much time people look at one versus the other, and how much switching goes on. But it's all self-report based, right? So they have to report how much time they're looking at each image. But there they've shown like feeling negative emotions makes you focus on other negative stimuli more. They dominate visual consciousness more. CFS is a little bit different in that it actually suppresses things from awareness for longer periods of time. And so a lot of what we do with continuous flash suppression currently is present affective information outside of awareness. And it's a more kind of robust way of doing that than the binocular rivalry paradigm. And then doing the breakthrough